Chelsea. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you a short 3-book wrap-up that covers the books that I read for 2 different readathons in the month of April. Those were the Women Write Classic SFF Readathon, hosted by Maya from Maya Reads, and the Stay Home Reading Rush, which was like a mini condensed version of the regular Reading Rush, formerly known as Booktubeathon. The goal for the Women Write Classic SFF Readathon was optimally to read 3 books. I only managed one of them, in part because I was just really engrossed in another book at the same time that wasn't on my TBR for that readathon. But the book that I did read that I was super excited to have read was Travel Light by Naomi Mitchison. This was originally published in 1952. I had very little idea of what to expect from it, except I was told it was fairy tale-ish and had some mythology elements in it, and that it was an adventure story with a female protagonist, which made me want to see what was being written in the 50s that was fairy tale-ish with mythology and had a female protagonist. This is such an excellent little book. I highly recommend it. It starts off with a premise from like a lost princess fairy tale, takes a steep turn immediately into Norse mythology and dragons, and then eventually wanders out of Norse mythology into the Christian world. You could probably call this a coming-of-age story about a girl named Hala. She was born a princess with a wicked stepmother who had her turned out as a small child. She was taken in by bears and then raised by dragons. She grows up sympathetic to the ways of the dragons and other monsters of mythology and legend, which is the sort of like fantasy commentary and twist on tropes that I would expect from fantasy written like several decades later than this. I honestly didn't really know that was being done as early as the 50s. Hala grows up with a hatred of traditional heroes who slay dragons and take their treasure for themselves. There is a Valkyrie who keeps showing up every time a quote-unquote hero dies, and she is great. She's like, whoop! Here's another dead sucker for the Allfather. But Hala is not destined to live as a dragon forever. She is destined to be a traveler and see more of the world. She has a fateful encounter with the Allfather, who convinces her to put aside dragon hoarding and instead to travel light. And what I think are probably the meatier portions of this book involve Hala's journeys with a group of men she encounters whom we might think of as actual heroes, in that they are downtrodden common people who take incredible risks to go on a journey in search of justice. They travel to the city that Hala knows as Micklegard, which is Byzantium, Constantinople, the seat of the Holy Roman Empire, and Hala's traveling companions there have some of their faith in the righteousness of their government and its adherence to the religious values it ostensibly promotes shaken by the greed and corruption that they encounter. There were any number of times in this book where I was worried that it was going to take a narrative turn where like Hala was going to fall in love with a hero, or like learn to live among good honest folk or something like that that would have been predictable and disappointing, and it never did any of that. It always went in a totally unexpected direction. The ending of this book was totally unexpected for me, and I loved it. It was such a delightful surprise. The reason this was a 4-star read for me, not 5, was I think because the writing style was just a little slow for me to make my way through. There's nothing difficult about it, but there's nothing particularly like immersive or fun about it either. This is a very short book, but it still took me quite a few days to read because it didn't necessarily like draw me in and make me not want to put it down. But if you're interested in like some early feminist fantasy, I highly recommend this. I don't really know whether to call this a children's book, a YA book, an adult book, or what. The introduction of this edition suggests that it might have been intended as a children's book. Small Beer Press has labeled it on the back as YA. I think It doesn't read like modern YA, but just in terms of the content, I would be more likely to categorize this as YA than either children's or adult. There's nothing wildly inappropriate for children that happens on the page, but some of the themes are pretty heavy and serious, and there's some like implied threat of rape that isn't explicitly stated, so it would probably go over a younger reader's head, but a more mature reader will know exactly what's being talked about. There's also some pretty horrible stuff that happens to some people off the page, again, that is reported in very vague terms that I think it's easy to fill in the gaps there, even though nothing is graphically described. And because I do see this as a coming-of-age story, I think I would be more likely to put it in the YA category than children's, certainly. But I think this is a book that would mostly these days probably appeal to adult fantasy readers who are interested in the history of the genre. So then on to the Stay Home Reading Rush. I hit all of the challenges with 2 books. The first, Tales from Outer Suburbia by Shaun, which I used for read a book in the same room the whole time. And then The House on the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune, which hit all of the other challenges for me. So Tales from Outer Suburbia, I'm going to see if I can just like flip through it so you can see the sort of composition of images and text that this has in all sorts of different artistic styles and page layouts. This is stories that are so short, they're like flash fiction. Most of them are only a few pages long, even with illustrations. They're not so much like full story arcs, but more like little snapshots. And the theme of the collection is strange suburbia. I do love Shaun Tan's art, the sort of surreal, strange whimsy of it. For the first chunk of this book, I think I was wrestling with how I felt about the treatment of suburbia as the main topic of the book, the main setting, the theme of the collection. With this many stories sort of centered around that theme, it sort of almost presents an image of the suburban nuclear family as like the default universal experience, which I feel weird about, because while that is how I grew up, in a suburban nuclear family, that's not how I live anymore. And so I do feel sort of weird about the nostalgia for that way of life as sort of universal that I felt like it was kind of tapping into in the early stories of this book. It does take a darker turn later in the collection. Some of them are more unsettling, kind of bordering on dystopian with the suburbia theme, and I really appreciated that variety. It was around like the Nameless Holiday here, and then this one, The Amnesia Machine, which is presented as this newspaper clipping, and you can read all of the different things around it that are equally, you know, sort of weird and disturbing, that I started getting like serious Night Vale vibes out of this. I was having a hard time figuring out in the earlier portions how I was going to describe the weirdness of the stories. And then I got to some of the darker ones near the end and I was like, aha, this is like Night Vale, except not always as dark. A couple of my favorites in this collection that stuck out to me were No Other Country, which is about a family that lives in like a really terrible, impoverished country where everything is horrible and nothing grows. And they discover that their house has this secret inner courtyard where everything is beautiful and flourishes. I also want to mention the very last story, which is just this one-page spread. It is called Night of the Turtle Rescue. And it was such a note to end on because the title made me laugh out loud, and then the story ended up like hitting deep in the feels and it made me almost cry. And that was like a lot of emotional whiplash in one page. It's basically just one paragraph. So I gave this 4 stars. I know there's a more recent, I think, collection from Shaun Tan called Tales from the Inner City. I would love to see what his treatment of city life is like in comparison with the Suburbia collection. So I'm gonna eventually see if I can get my hands on that. And then The House in the Cerulean Sea, which is going to be the longest, chunkiest novel thing in this wrap-up. This is a recent release that I had seen recommended as a great comfort read for pandemic reading. It is that, I can confirm. I'm going to start, I think, with the one thing that sort of tripped me up about this book, and then the rest is going to be warm and glowing. It is nearly impossible to get a grasp on, like, the world of this book. It clearly takes place in a version of our world because the music is from our world and Christianity is a thing that exists, but there are no really good hints about where this takes place, like when the government is mentioned, what government is it? Or when, if this is like a time period that has any real equivalent in our world. There are things about it that feel vintagey and other things that feel modern. The music is all on records. There don't seem to be cassettes or CDs or digital music. There are computers, but there don't seem to be smartphones. Gay marriage is legal. It's a little bit all over the place, but more, I think, to create a particular mood than to create a cohesive fantasy world. And it does, I think, create a very specific mood. What we do know about this fantasy world is that there are both humans and magical creatures who are also people. Many of the magical people seem to be very human-like, but many of them, including a few that we meet in this book, are not. Our main character, Linus, is a caseworker with a sort of low-level, drudgy office job at the department in charge of magical youths. As a caseworker, his job is to write up reports on orphanages for magical youths and see if they are up to regulation. Linus is lonely and sad, though he refuses to admit it. He has this job because on some level he genuinely believes that what he does helps the children, and he has always kept his head down and refused to question whether or not that's actually the case. So he gets chosen by extremely upper management, and they're literally called that. They're called extremely upper management, for a top secret job writing up a report on a very classified orphanage where 6 children live who are considered extremely dangerous or unusual. And he's literally been chosen for this job because he is the most unremarkable and biddable employee that extremely upper management can find. The whole extremely upper management thing is sort of cartoon villainish. Make that extremely cartoon villainish, which contributed to my feeling early on that I couldn't quite get, put my finger on the style of the book. But this is the story of how Linus gets shaken out of his complacency in life by his stay at this island orphanage with its very special little found family. There is a romance between Linus and the master of the orphanage, Arthur. It is very slow burn and very sweet, but the majority of this book and where most of its charm comes from is all of the eccentric child rearing. So if that is a thing that makes you happy, you will love this. I will say that one of the children at this orphanage is the Antichrist, and it is awfully hard to do a story about trying to raise the Antichrist as a normal kid without Good Omens comparisons, and I do think Good Omens does that particular storyline better. But all 6 of these kids are really great. One of them is like a moody garden gnome. Another one is a particularly delightful sentient blob of goo who wants to be a bellhop when he grows up. There's a whole storyline about the mainland village that is where this island orphanage is across the water from, and those people learning to overcome their fear and hatred of the inhabitants of the island. That's as presented as a sort of microcosm for how the wider world might grow to be more accepting of magical people. So it's a very warm, very hopeful, uplifting book if you're looking for a comfort read, I do recommend it. I gave it 4 stars. And there you have it. Those are the 3 books that I read for those 2 readathons. Here they are this way because 2 of them have such short spines you can't see them. Anyhow, let me know if you've read any of these books, or if you want to, let me know what you think. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.